The sterile scent of the hospital room still clung to my clothes, a memory of cold steel and the terrifying whisper of anesthesia. But it was the silence of my home that truly hollowed me out, not the familiar, comforting quiet I'd grown to cherish in my later years. The gentle hum of my refrigerator or the distant chirping of crickets, but a profound, unnatural stillness that pressed in on me from every corner. My eyes, still a little blurry from the lingering effects of the medication, scanned the entryway, then the living room, then the small worn rug in the hallway that Sparky always seemed to shed on. A constant, endearing battle against vacuum cleaner apathy. No happy bark, no scramble of paws against the polished wood floors, no enthusiastic nudge against my hand as I fumbled with my keys. He wasn't there. I had known, of course, that I wouldn't walk in and find him waiting. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, had assured me repeatedly that she would pick him up from the kennel the moment I was discharged. Her voice, usually so bright and effervescent, had held a strange, almost clipped quality on the phone, a tone I'd dismissed as the stress of managing a household and looking after her ailing mother-in-law. It was a familiar pattern with Sarah, her charming veneer occasionally slipping just enough to reveal something sharp beneath, a hint of steel that always seemed to disappear as quickly as it appeared, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined it. I'd attributed it to my own fatigue, my lingering anxiety about the surgery, anything but the unsettling possibility that she might be deliberately withholding something. The surgery, a complicated abdominal procedure, had left me weak, vulnerable, my thoughts a hazy jumble of pain and fleeting, medicated dreams. Sparky, my faithful golden retriever, my shadow, my confidant through years of quiet grief, after David passed, had been the one constant comfort throughout the ordeal. The thought of his soft fur and warm presence, a beacon in the uncertainty. He was my family, the beating heart of this quiet house. I'd entrusted him to Sarah, because who else could I trust? She was my son's wife, the mother of my grandchildren. She had promised, with that radiant smile she reserved for public consumption, that Sparky would be cared for as if he were her own. I remember her saying, "Don't you worry about a thing, Evelyn. Sparky is safe with us. He'll be so happy to see you when you get back," tail wagging like crazy. The image had warmed me, even on the coldest pre-op morning. Now, the memory of her words twisted in my gut, a bitter irony. My own son, Mark, had been quiet on the phone too, unusually so. He just reiterated Sarah's assurances, his voice thin, distant. I'd dismissed his reticence as his usual discomfort with hospitals, his general aversion to anything that smacked of illness or distress. He was a good boy, Mark. Always had been, but he possessed an infuriating tendency to defer to Sarah, to melt into her shadow when her desires were strong enough. A quiet, unassuming man, easily swayed by a louder, more assertive personality. I'd watched this dynamic play out for years, a silent observer to his slow, gradual absorption into Sarah's orbit. It had been subtle at first, just small choices, preferences bending to hers. Then it grew, encompassing larger decisions, until it felt as though Mark had ceased to exist as an independent entity, his opinions merely echoes of Sarah's pronouncements. But I had never imagined it would extend to Sparky, to my heart itself. The house felt colder without him, the air heavier, like a void where his vibrant spirit should have been. I walked into the kitchen, his food bowl still on the mat, empty, a cruel monument to his absence. His favorite squeaky toy lay abandoned under the dining table, a vibrant red smear against the dark wood. I picked it up, the familiar texture a painful reminder of the games we would play, the joyous chaos he brought to my otherwise orderly life. My throat tightened, a dry, aching lump. Something was terribly wrong. I felt it in my bones, a creeping dread that had nothing to do with the lingering effects of surgery and everything to do with a betrayal I hadn't yet named. The call to Sarah was met with an answering machine, her cheerful, recorded voice mocking my rising panic. I tried Mark's phone, only for it to go straight to voicemail. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't right. This wasn't how good people behaved, how responsible family members acted. I tried again and again until my fingers ached and my phone grew warm against my ear. The silence on their end was deafening. A deliberate barrier. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the living room in long, unsettling shadows. And still no one called back. I dragged myself to the sofa, my body protesting every movement, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the growing anguish in my heart. Sparky had been my anchor, my constant companion since David, my husband, passed away nearly 5 years ago. He was David's dog. Initially, a boisterous puppy David had brought home on a whim, insisting that an empty nest needed filling. I had scoffed then, a bit annoyed by the sudden disruption to our peaceful routine, but Sparky had quickly wormed his way into my affections, becoming my shadow, my four-legged therapist. After David was gone, it was Sparky who licked away my tears, nudged my hand when I retreated into myself, and filled the echoing silence of the house with his comforting presence. He was a symbol of continuity, of love that endured, of a life that, despite its losses, still held warmth and joy. To have him gone was not merely to lose a pet, it was to lose a piece of my past, a living connection to David, a part of my very soul. I remembered the conversation with Sarah a few weeks before the surgery, when she'd first suggested Sparky go to a kennel. "It's really the safest option, Evelyn," she'd said, her voice laced with what sounded like concern. "You won't be able to care for him properly right after the surgery, and you don't want him getting underfoot, do you?" I'd resisted, of course, explaining that Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor, usually helped out. But Sarah had been insistent, weaving a narrative of potential dangers of the kennel's superior care, of Sparky being a burden to Mrs. Henderson. She'd worn me down with her relentless honeyed persuasion, her arguments sounding so logical on the surface, so imbued with a supposed concern for my well-being. "It's for your recovery, Evelyn," she'd emphasized, as if the well-being of my dog was secondary to the convenience of my rehabilitation. I had relented, exhausted by her persistent pressure, by the fear that she might be right, that I truly wouldn't be able to give Sparky the attention he deserved in my weakened state. I had chosen the most reputable, expensive kennel in the area, ensuring he would be safe and well cared for. Sarah had agreed to pick him up after my discharge. A simple task, a favor that seemed so small, so uncomplicated. Now, in the stark reality of my empty house, with the shadows lengthening and the silence screaming, I understood. The knot in my stomach tightened, a slow, agonizing twist. The next morning, I was too weak to even get out of bed, the surgery site throbbing with a dull, insistent ache. My phone, however, was clutched in my hand, my thumb hovering over Sarah's contact. I was afraid to call, afraid of what she would say, afraid of the truth that was pressing in on me like a suffocating weight. But the fear of not knowing was worse. When she finally answered, her voice was still cheerful, almost artificially so. "Evelyn, how are you feeling?" "Recovering well, I hope." There was no apology for not calling back. No mention of my frantic attempts to reach her. It was as if the past 24 hours hadn't happened. My voice, surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in my hand, cut through her pleasantries. "Sarah, where is Sparky?" The pause on her end was immediate, stark, like a sudden crack in a carefully constructed facade. "Oh, Sparky," she began, her tone shifting, becoming a touch softer, more solicitous. "Well, Evelyn, about Sparky. Mark and I had a long talk while you were in the hospital. We just felt he needed a different environment." My breath caught in my throat. A different environment? What did that even mean? "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising, pushing through the pain. "Where is my dog, Sarah?" "He's been rehomed, Evelyn," she said, her voice suddenly flat, devoid of emotion. "We found him a lovely family, a young couple with a big yard, lots of kids. He'll be very happy there. It's what's best for him, really, considering your condition. And Mark's allergies. You know, Mark's allergies? Mark hadn't suffered from allergies in years. Not since he was a child. This was a lie, A cruel, flimsy excuse. The blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling cold and lightheaded. Rehomed. The word hung in the air. A death knell to my hopes, to my heart. She hadn't even consulted me. She had made this decision while I was lying unconscious, vulnerable, trusting her with the most precious thing I had left. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute. It stole my breath away. It was a calculated act, meticulously planned, timed perfectly for when I was at my weakest, least able to resist. How could you? I whispered, the words barely audible, tears blurring my vision. How could you do something so cruel, so heartless? Her voice hardened, losing its last vestiges of warmth. Evelyn, you're being dramatic. It's just a dog. Hungry did what was best. He deserves a family that can actively care for him, not someone recovering from major surgery. Think of it as an act of kindness. An act of kindness. It was an act of pure, unadulterated selfishness, masked by a thin veil of concern. She had discarded him, discarded a living, breathing being who had loved me unconditionally, as if he were an unwanted piece of furniture. She had violated my trust, my sanctuary, my very sense of security. I hung up the phone, the cold plastic still vibrating in my hand. The tears came then, hot and stinging, a torrent of grief and rage that shook my fragile body. I wept not just for Sparky, for the loss of his comforting presence, but for the profound loneliness that suddenly enveloped me. The realization that the people I thought I could depend on, my own son and his wife, had proven to be nothing more than fair-weather companions, capable of unimaginable cruelty disguised as pragmatism. The image of Sarah's beaming face, her assurances that Sparky would be safe, played on an endless loop in my mind, each repetition a fresh stab of pain. It wasn't just a dog, it was Sparky. It was my family. It was my connection to David. It was the last shred of undisturbed peace I had. The following days were a blur of pain, both physical and emotional. I tried to call Sparky's kennel, but they politely informed me that the dog had been picked up by the individual authorized on the paperwork, Sarah. They couldn't provide any further details, citing privacy. I tried to reach Sarah again, to beg, to plead, to understand, but she ignored my calls. Mark, my son, finally answered, after several attempts, his voice laced with an uncomfortable tension. "Mom, Sarah was just trying to help," he mumbled. A weak defense that only inflamed my anger. Help? By giving away my dog without my permission? While I was unconscious in a hospital bed, my voice was raw, laced with disbelief. Sparky was family. Mark, he was my companion. How could you let her do this? He sighed, a sound of exasperation that felt like a slap. Mom, you're not well enough to handle a dog right now. And Sarah really thinks it's for the best. She found him a wonderful home. Truly. His words were Sarah's words, regurgitated without an ounce of independent thought. He was a puppet, dancing to her tune, and the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. My son, my flesh and blood, had betrayed me too, not through active malice, but through a spineless passivity that allowed his wife's cruelty to flourish unchecked. The boy I had raised, who once rescued stray kittens and brought home injured birds, had become a man incapable of standing up for his own mother, for the most vulnerable member of our small family. I hung up, the conversation leaving me with a sense of profound emptiness, a void where my trust had once been. Days bled into weeks. The physical wounds from surgery slowly began to heal, but the emotional ones festered. The house, once a haven, felt like a mausoleum. Every shadow seemed to hold Sparky's shape. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like his paws. I spent hours staring at old photographs. Sparky as a puppy, a fluffy golden ball of energy. Sparky curled at David's feet. Sparky's head resting on my lap, his eyes full of soulful understanding. Each image was a fresh wave of grief, a reminder of what had been so cruelly taken. Sarah, meanwhile, resumed her normal pattern of occasional superficial visits, always with Mark in tow, always with a bright plastic smile pasted on her face. She'd bring casseroles I didn't touch, offer platitudes about my recovery, and act as if nothing significant had happened. There was a smugness in her eyes, a flicker of triumph that she couldn't quite conceal, as if she had won some silent battle. She never mentioned Sparky again, and I too remained silent, too raw to confront her, too exhausted to fight the battle head-on. But beneath my quiet exterior, something was shifting. The initial shock, the overwhelming grief, slowly began to give way to a simmering anger, a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was furious. Furious at Sarah for her callous disregard. Furious at Mark for his spinelessness. Furious at myself for having trusted them, for being so vulnerable, the feeling of being undervalued, dismissed as an emotional aging woman who couldn't possibly know what was best for her own life, ignited a spark within me. They thought I was weak. They thought they could walk all over me, take what was mine and suffer no consequences. They were wrong. My quiet strength, usually reserved for enduring life's inevitable hardships, began to morph into something sharper, something with an edge. I started to observe Sarah more closely during her visits. Her expensive clothes, her meticulously manicured nails, the way she spoke about her latest shopping sprees, her new car, a sleek, expensive European model, pristine and always perfectly parked in my driveway, as if it belonged there. She had brought the car to my house, initially because their garage was too full, and she loved to park it under my old oak tree, claiming the shade was better for the paint. It was a gift from Mark, or so she'd claimed, a reward for her tireless work managing their busy lives. But I knew, deep down, that the money had come from my savings. The money I had gifted Mark over the years, carefully, responsibly for his future. Mark had always been a terrible saver, and Sarah, with her extravagant tastes, had quickly drained any funds he accumulated. So I had helped him, quietly, discreetly, hoping to ensure his financial stability. And now, that money, my money, had manifested as this gleaming symbol of her vanity, parked on my property, a constant reminder of their comfortable lives built, in part, on my quiet generosity. A subtle irony began to form in my mind, a dark, satisfying symmetry. The car, it was her prized possession, a sleek silver symbol of her status, her perceived success. She doted on it, fussing over every speck of dust, every minor scratch. It was more than just transportation. It was an extension of her identity, a gleaming testament to her carefully curated image of prosperity and refinement. I remembered her once boasting, during one of her rare moments of genuine excitement, about how Mark had wanted to buy her something smaller, more practical, but she had insisted on this specific model, the most expensive one on the lot. "It just feels right, you know," she'd cooed, running a hand over the polished hood. "It perfectly reflects us." The sheer arrogance of it, the casual entitlement, had struck me even then. A fleeting pang of unease. But I had dismissed it, as I always did, choosing to focus on the imagined happiness of my son and his family. Now the memory of her words, "It perfectly reflects us," echoed with a different meaning. It reflected her self-absorption, her disregard for anyone else's needs or feelings. The car was her comfort, her status, her freedom. It was her Sparky. The idea, when it first fully coalesced, felt like a lightning strike, a sudden blinding flash of clarity in the murky depths of my grief. It was audacious, even cruel, but a delicious sense of justice settled over me. It was a mirror, a precise reflection of the callousness she had inflicted upon me. She had taken my family, my unconditional love, and discarded it. I would take her family, her prized possession, and discard it. The thought, initially a fleeting whisper of dark fantasy, began to take root, nurtured by my lingering pain and the growing anger. It was a tangible way to reclaim a piece of myself, a way to show them that I was not merely a helpless old woman, easily manipulated and dismissed. My mind, usually so orderly and cautious, became consumed by the logistics, the practicalities. The car was, as it happened, still registered in my name. I had purchased it from Mark years ago, when his old jalopy finally gave up the ghost. I had insisted on putting it in my name, a safety measure, a quiet assurance that if anything ever went wrong, I would have some legal leverage. Mark had grumbled, of course, but he had acquiesced, caught between his desire for a new car and his lazy aversion to paperwork. Sarah had never questioned it, assuming it was simply a matter of convenience, a trivial detail in the grand scheme of their opulent lifestyle. She had driven it for years, treating it as her own, never once suggesting a transfer of ownership, never bothering to check the details. This small, overlooked detail, this minor precaution from years ago, now presented itself as a golden opportunity. The irony was exquisite. Her casual indifference, her assumption of ownership, had become her undoing. The first step was to discreetly gather the necessary documents. The car's title, tucked away in a dusty folder in my safe, felt heavy in my hand, a literal key to her undoing. I moved with a quiet intensity, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before David died. The physical pain from my surgery seemed to recede, replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a steely resolve. I consulted with a lawyer, a kindly, meticulous man named Mr. Thompson, who had handled David's estate. I didn't reveal the full, messy emotional context, merely stating that I wished to transfer ownership of a vehicle that was technically mine, but used by family members. He asked no questions, his gaze professional and unblinking, simply outlining the legal requirements, the forms, the process. He spoke of charitable donations, of tax implications, of the simplest ways to execute such a transfer. He gave me options, and my mind immediately latched onto the one that felt most satisfyingly symbolic. Donating it, not selling it, not giving it to a random stranger, but bestowing it upon someone truly deserving, someone who needed it, someone whose life it could genuinely improve. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about rectification, about channeling the injustice I had suffered into a positive outcome, even if the primary motivation was a sharp, biting retaliation. It felt clean, in a perverse way. It felt empowering. The idea of donating it to a charity for single mothers, or perhaps a family struggling to get by, began to take root. It would be a stark contrast to Sarah's entitled ownership, a way to highlight the disparity between her casual disregard and the genuine needs of others. The more I thought about it, the more resolute I became. The emotional current that had been a raging river of grief and anger began to narrow, focusing its energy into a cold, precise stream of determination. The silence of the house no longer felt empty, but rather filled with the hum of my own thoughts, the meticulous planning of my retribution. I felt a strange lightness, a sense of having shed a heavy burden. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. But it was a step away from the suffocating despair. The thought of Sparky still brought a pang to my chest, a dull, aching throb that would likely never fully disappear. But now it was accompanied by a defiant resolve. I would not be broken. I would not be dismissed. I would not be undervalued. This act, this quiet, deliberate reversal of fortunes, would be my answer to their cruelty. It wasn't about winning, not in the traditional sense, but about demonstrating that I, Evelyn, still had agency, still had power, still had a voice, even if it was a voice that spoke through actions rather than words. The slow burn of my pain was turning into a carefully controlled flame, ready to ignite. The day I chose to execute my plan was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day Sarah usually spent at her boutique, immersed in the world of high fashion and designer labels. Mark, my son, would be at work, lost in the predictable routine of his office job. It was a day when their world would be spinning oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in mine. I woke with a strange sense of calm, a focused intensity that silenced the usual anxieties that had plagued me since Sparky's disappearance. My surgery incision, though still tender, felt remarkably less painful, as if my body too was rallying for the task ahead. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple, functional outfit, nothing that would draw attention. My movements were deliberate, each step precise, weighted with purpose. The car, Sarah's gleaming silver prize, sat in my driveway, parked perfectly under the ancient oak tree, just as it always was. It looked almost arrogant in its pristine state, basking in the morning sun, utterly unaware of its impending fate. TC. I walked around it, running a hand over the cool metal, a ghost of a smile touching my lips. It was a beautiful car, undeniably, but its beauty was superficial, a facade, much like its owner. I had already made arrangements with a local charity that helps single mothers achieve self-sufficiency, often providing them with reliable transportation. Their mission resonated with me, a stark contrast to the self-serving actions of my daughter-in-law. The woman I'd spoken to, a kind, no-nonsense director named Ms. Davies, had been incredibly grateful for the unexpected donation. "This will change someone's life, Mrs. Miller," she'd said, her voice warm with genuine appreciation. Reliable transport is often the biggest barrier for these women trying to get back on their feet. The thought filled me with a quiet satisfaction, a sense of turning something destructive into something truly beneficial. It felt like a cleansing act, transforming Sarah's symbol of vanity into a beacon of hope for someone else. Armed with the signed title, the keys, and a sense of unshakable resolve, I called a taxi. When it arrived, I simply got in, gave the driver the address of the charity's offices, and watched as the taxi pulled away from my driveway, leaving Sarah's car behind. I didn't look back. There was no need. The decision had been made. The die cast. At the charity's office, the process was straightforward. Ms. Davies met me with a warm smile, guided me through the final paperwork, and accepted the keys with a heartfelt thanks. I explained that I would have the car towed to their location later that day, as I wasn't able to drive it myself. She understood, expressing nothing but gratitude. As I left the office, a strange mix of emotions swirled within me. A triumphant surge of vindication, a lingering pang of the pain that had brought me to this point, and a profound sense of empowerment. It wasn't the kind of joy that made you laugh aloud, but a deeper, quieter satisfaction, the kind that settled in your bones. I had taken back control. I had acted. I had turned a devastating betrayal into an act of quiet rebellion, and perhaps even an act of grace. The call came late that afternoon, just as I was making myself a cup of herbal tea, the quiet hum of my new life settling around me. It was Mark, his voice an agitated bark. "Mom, where's Sarah's car?" "She went out to get groceries and it's gone." "Did you move it?" His tone was accusatory, demanding, utterly devoid of concern for me or my well-being. It was all about the car. The immediate shift in his focus, from my well-being to his wife's lost vehicle, was a stark confirmation of his priorities. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the warmth, allowing a moment of silence to stretch between us, drawing out his agitation. "Oh, that," I said, my voice calm, almost placid. "Yes, I had it towed away." His stunned silence was almost comical. "Towed away? Why? Where? What are you talking about?" His questions tumbled out, a frantic, unthinking cascade. "It was cluttering my driveway," I replied, a hint of steel in my voice that I rarely allowed myself to display. "And since it's registered in my name, and I no longer had use for it, I decided to donate it." A guttural sound erupted from his end of the line, a strangled gasp of disbelief. Then Sarah's voice, sharp and piercing, cut through the phone line. "You did what, Evelyn? You can't be serious. That's my car." "Mark bought me that car." Her voice was shrill, laced with an almost hysterical disbelief, rising quickly in volume and intensity. The carefully constructed facade she presented to the world was shattering, revealing the raw, ugly anger beneath. "It was never your car, Sarah," I stated, my voice even, measured, a stark contrast to her escalating fury. "It was legally mine. I bought it. It was registered in my name, and I gave it away. There was a stunned silence. Then Sarah's voice, full of venom. You old hag. You deliberately did this. This is some kind of sick joke. Where is it? Tell me where it is right now. Her voice had become a piercing shriek, utterly devoid of the sweet, solicitous tones she usually adopted. She called me an old hag, a bitter, vicious insult that sliced through the air like a knife. It was a raw, unvarnished expression of her true contempt, stripped of all pretense. It's been donated to a very worthy cause, I continued, ignoring her insults, focusing on the calm delivery of my statement, on the power that radiated from my newfound resolve. A charity that helps single mothers get back on their feet. Someone who genuinely needs it will be very grateful for it. There was another beat of shocked silence, followed by a torrent of furious accusations. You're insane. You're just a bitter, lonely old woman. How dare you?
We'll sue you. We'll get it back.
You can't just give away someone else's property. Her threats were empty. I knew. They were all bluster, born of shock and fury. But they revealed the depth of her entitlement, the sheer audacity of her belief that what was hers, regardless of how she acquired it, or what she had done to others. It was never your property to begin with, Sarah. I calmly reiterated, a quiet, almost serene sense of power settling over me. And as for suing, I suggest you consult with a lawyer. I did. Every step was perfectly legal. I paused, letting the weight of my words hang in the air, allowing her to fully comprehend the cold, hard reality of the situation. You gave away my family, Sarah, I said, my voice dropping slightly, imbued with a quiet, undeniable finality. You discarded the most important thing I had, while I was vulnerable and helpless. So I gave away yours. It seems only fair, doesn't it? The ensuing silence was deafening, broken only by Sarah's ragged breathing on the other end of the line. It was a silence filled with the echo of my words, a sharp, bitter truth delivered with surgical precision. Then she let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief, before the line went dead. She had hung up. I sat there, phone still in hand, a strange sense of equilibrium settling over me. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't pounding. There was no triumph, no wild exhilaration, just a quiet, profound sense of justice, a feeling that a cosmic scale had been balanced, however imperfectly. The phone rang again, almost immediately.
It was Mark, his voice strained, desperate, trying to mediate, trying to reason with me. Mom, please.
Sarah's hysterical. She's threatening to call the police. You can't just do this. It's not right. His pleas were pathetic, tinged with a helplessness that made me ache for the son he once was, before Sarah had twisted him into this spineless echo. She called the police, Mark? I asked, my voice still calm, almost serene. On her own mother-in-law, for illegally disposing of her own property? Let her. She'll find out just how little ground she has to stand on. I could hear Sarah screaming in the background, a chaotic, incoherent wail. This is payback, isn't it, Mom? Mark whispered, his voice low, as if he finally understood, finally saw the connection, but still recoiled from the implication. For Sparky? You did this for Sparky? The raw, unvarnished truth hung between us, heavy and undeniable. Sparky was my family. Mark, I said, the words weighted with all the grief and betrayal I had endured. He was not just a dog. He was my companion, my comfort, my last link to your father, and she gave him away while I was in surgery, unable to defend myself or him. She ripped a piece of my heart out, and you stood by and let her. His silence on the other end of the line was a condemnation, a quiet acknowledgement of his own complicity. He knew it was true. He just hadn't wanted to face it. You have no idea what she put me through, he muttered, a weak attempt at justification, deflecting responsibility. She insisted. She wouldn't let up. The words were a pathetic excuse, an admission of his own weakness, his inability to stand up to his manipulative wife. No idea? I retorted, a sharp, emotional punch. I watched her twist you around her little finger for years, Mark. I saw it all. But I never thought she would be so cruel, and I never thought you would be so weak. That car was her comfort, her status, her freedom. It was her Sparky. Now she knows what it feels like to have something precious, something taken for granted, stripped away. I didn't wait for his reply. I hung up. The phone in my hand felt lighter now, no longer a conduit for their anger and despair, but a symbol of my reclaimed autonomy. The quiet hum of the house settled back in, but this time, it was not the oppressive silence of grief, but the peaceful hum of a new beginning. My heart still ached for Sparky, a deep, pervasive sorrow that would likely never fully fade. But beneath that ache, a quiet strength had taken root, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I had stood up for myself. I had honored Sparky's memory, and I had, finally, exacted a measure of justice, not out of malice, but out of a profound need for self-preservation, for dignity. The fallout, as expected, was immediate and severe. Sarah's calls escalated from furious threats to bewildered pleas, interspersed with sobbing accusations. She tried every tactic from feigned remorse to outright emotional blackmail, none of which landed. She even sent Mark over, a few days later, a visibly diminished figure, shuffling uncomfortably on my doorstep. He looked tired, defeated, the light gone from his eyes. He stammered through an apology, half-hearted and clearly coerced, begging me to reconsider. "Mom, please. Sarah says she'll do anything. She'll get you another dog. Just tell us where the car is." He sounded utterly desperate, a hollow shell of his former self, a man utterly dominated by his wife's whims and demands. "There is no another dog, Mark," I said, my voice soft but firm, unyielding. Sparky was irreplaceable. And the car is gone. It's found a new home. A real home, where it will be valued and needed. His shoulders slumped. He knew it was over. He knew there was no going back. The strained relationship with my son, already fragile, snapped then. A clean break, surprisingly without further acrimony. He stopped calling. They stopped visiting. My life, once filled with the uneasy tension of their sporadic appearances, became genuinely quiet, truly peaceful. The absence of their dramatic demands, their superficial charm and underlying manipulation, was a breath of fresh air. It was a profound isolation, yes, but it was an isolation I had chosen, one that felt like a quiet liberation. The house began to feel like mine again, truly mine, unburdened by their lingering presence. I started to rearrange furniture, to redecorate, to reclaim spaces that had felt stifled by their unspoken expectations. I found an old faded blanket that had been Sparky's favorite, and carefully folded it, placing it in a keepsake box, rather than trying to pretend he would still be here. The ache of his absence was still present, a dull throb in my heart, but it was no longer a suffocating grief. It was now a quiet sorrow, tempered by the knowledge that I had acted, that I had not allowed myself to be trampled. I spent more time in my garden, tending to the roses, feeling the earth beneath my hands, a grounding connection to something tangible and real. I reconnected with old friends, neighbors who had quietly observed my struggle, offering subtle gestures of support. Mrs. Henderson, my kind neighbor, brought over a homemade pie one afternoon, a quiet offering of solidarity. She didn't need to ask. She knew. She simply squeezed my hand and offered a small, understanding smile. "Some people just don't understand the depth of love for a companion," she murmured, her eyes kind. I simply nodded, the unspoken empathy a balm to my weary soul. Months passed. The seasons turned, bringing with them the crisp promise of autumn, then the quiet hush of winter, and finally the tender green shoots of spring. I saw Sarah and Mark, sometimes, at the grocery store, or driving past my house, their faces etched with a peculiar mix of resentment and forced indifference. They never stopped. They never looked my way. It was as if I had become a ghost to them, a living, breathing reminder of a truth they couldn't bear to acknowledge. And in a way I was the ghost of the woman they had thought they could control. the specter of their own unkindness, haunting their carefully constructed lives. I sometimes wondered about Sparky, if he was truly happy in his new home, if he missed me even a fraction as much as I missed him. I allowed myself those moments of lingering sadness, knowing they were a necessary part of healing, a testament to the depth of my love for him. But I no longer allowed them to consume me. My quiet strength, forged in the crucible of betrayal, had solidified into a bedrock of self-respect. The bittersweet realization was that while I had lost my beloved companion, I had found myself. I had learned that empowerment didn't always come with grand gestures or public declarations, but sometimes it arrived in the quiet, decisive act of reclaiming what was rightfully yours, even if it meant walking away from people you once called family. My house was quiet, yes, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the resonant hum of my own peace, a tranquility earned through pain and resilience, a testament to a life lived with integrity, even in the face of profound betrayal. The lingering scent of the sterile hospital had long since faded, replaced by the scent of fresh-cut flowers from my garden, a symbol of new growth, of quiet, enduring strength, blooming in the silence of my reclaimed home. And in that quiet I found a new kind of freedom, a profound sense of having finally found my way back to myself,